There's a certain allure that comes with ITX cases, be it the tight spaces that dare ask the question, will it fit, or the unique designs and premium materials which are often associated with them. But there's also the obvious benefit of the much smaller footprint and likewise a less dominant presence wherever they are placed. Which was the exact reason why I went back to ITX. I wanted to move my gaming PC to the living room to enjoy my Steam library from a new angle. However, my Fractal North wasn't and isn't exactly an approved item in that area. Despite its dashingly good looks, it's simply too large and sticks out like a sore thumb. A more inconspicuous object was needed. If you are interested in doing something similar, maybe my journey of downsizing can help a little bit and give you some insights into the process. So come along if you want on this journey to a new era. If you've been with the channel for a while, you might remember that one of the first videos I made was about the Meshilicious, which was a tiny but mighty 14.6 liter ITX case. Back then, for some reason, I decided to jam the highest end components into that thing, which at the time were a 5950X and a 3090, whilst also making my first attempt at a full custom loop. For the most part, it worked out pretty well. For over 2 years it ran without any issues of thermal or other. Until one fateful night, whilst attempting to play my first session of Overwatch 2, the system started to repeatedly reboot out of the blue, until I realized that the temperatures had reached a boiling point. After a quick inspection, moisture was found. A leak had occurred. But this isn't what this video is about. However, there might be one or two folks out there who wonder what happened to the Meshilicious and why I ended up with an ATX case. So for those, I do feel obliged to provide some closure. If you are just interested in the Era 2 build, feel free to skip to the next part. I left markers down below. For anyone else, let's quickly wrap up. So after noticing this spill, I drained the entire system, double-checked all the fittings and refilled the loop once more, hoping that this little refresh was sufficient. It wasn't. Just a couple of weeks later, the same issues started happening again. Unfortunately, this time around, the leak decided to permanently take out a component, the motherboard. I didn't shoot a video at the time, but there were visible dark spots on the back, indicating my least favorite type of frying, that of electronics. I much prefer chicken. I decided it was time to simplify. I wanted more room to work with and be able to easier and quicker spot leaks. Thus, the North was chosen. I still kept to the same components though, except for the motherboard of course, and ran the system in a freshly filled loop for about 4 months until, yeah, the same issues started happening again. I ended up draining and checking everything once more until I caught the second culprit. This time, it was the water block on the GPU. It was only the tiniest bit, but the screws had somehow come loose over time and allowed the liquid to slowly drizzle down the sides. The results were extremely high temperatures that I somehow missed. I know there's a lot of somehows in this story. I should have been more careful for sure, because this time around the victim was the most expensive component, the 3090. After this, I had about enough of custom loops. I'm certain novice mistakes were made aplenty and could have been averted by a more seasoned hand at work. But at the time, I didn't want to invest more of my afternoon and nights to get things running. I needed to get back to work, fast. So I waved goodbye to the custom loop and instead went for an AIO solution. I also could have gone air, but thought, well, I have the space for radiators now, why not use it? AIO or all-in-one solutions are liquid coolers too, but essentially closed systems that come shipped as such. In smaller cases where there is not a lot of space, these can come in quite handy. On larger builds, it's not as common I think, but I kinda wanted to try out the fabled liquid freeze too and picked it for my 5950X, which luckily survived both watery attacks. Gravity be praised. By this time, the 4090 had also entered the market. I decided to take the costly upgrade to future-proof my system with the help of a very generous patron and friend. Thank you. Always game for a little unusual hardware choices, I went with the MSI GeForce RTX 4090 Supreme Liquid X, a mouth and handful of a card. The system then ran rock solid for the past year, taking everything I threw at it with ease until I began craving my Steam library in the living room. Which brings us neatly to the new build. Alright, if you skipped to this part, you missed a great story about my incompetence on my past build, but let's talk about the new one now. The goal was to downsize my entire ATX rig into an ITX enclosure, with the ambition of buying as few new parts as possible, which I, with great satisfaction can say, I absolutely failed at. However, I did keep the two costliest components, that is the CPU in the form of the AMD 5950X that I have since 4 years, and for me is still plenty sufficient, as well as an AIO-cooled 4090 with an attached 240mm radiator. Moving to or starting any ITX system will heavily depend on these two components, as they dictate which cases are even valid options. And impressive options there are aplenty, like the Nanook from Thorzone, the Slate Case AQ, or the N-Case M1 with the cheese grater that looks like a miniature Mac Pro. I was also very much interested in Fractal's new Mood, which seems to be specifically designed for the living room, but alas, none of these either fit my hardware nor were available at the time. I still ended up with Fractal though, but with the Era 2 instead of the Mood, and I couldn't be happier. The decision came down to the compatibility with my rather unusual GPU choice, which, because of the attached AIO cooling, has two tubes sticking out of its side, making the actual width of the card more like 170mm as opposed to the 140mm it says on the spec sheet. Any case where the GPU was positioned horizontally instantly got crossed off the list, as none of those that I looked at accounted for any slack on the side. Cases with vertical GPU mounting options seemed to fare a lot better, but here too I needed enough clearance towards the top to again not bend the tubes too much, which would have hindered the flow of water. I do believe the Mood would have worked too, but just because it fit the GPU didn't mean it was sufficient for other parts, such as the CPU cooler. The Mood supports a 280mm radiator as well, but it's on top of the CPU, leaving only enough clearance for the actual pump. Maybe a very low profile air cooler, one that would have definitely been too weak for my 5950X. The Era 2 on the other hand has the radiator mounted to the top, the rest sits underneath in a so-called sandwich layout, meaning the GPU and CPU sit on opposite sides, held together by the middle layer akin to cheese in a sandwich, which is, as we all know, the glue to all things delicious. Like some other sandwich cases, the Era 2 allows you to move this cheese level by adjusting a number of screws, letting you decide who gets the bigger room, the GPU or the CPU. In technical terms, that is up to a 3-slot GPU and 55mm for the CPU cooler, or prioritizing the CPU by giving it a maximum clearance of 70mm but reducing the available GPU space to a 2-slot design. I guess most will use the 3-slot option, but with my AIO-cooled GPU and its 240mm radiator in tow, I was able to give priority to the CPU, and thus had the 70mm of clearance I needed for the Noctua NHL12. This is a popular choice and one that has a very nifty trick up its sleeve. It blows air outwards instead of inwards or through the case like others. You see, the fan is mounted underneath the heat pipes and is oriented in a way to take cool air in from the bottom, run it through the fins, converting it to the same that comes out of my mouth most of the time, which is hot air, to then blow it straight out of the case. The Era 2 is perfect for this configuration, as it has the ventilation cutouts perfectly aligned with the cooler. Coupled with the two fans on the bottom that suck in fresh air, this makes for a pretty convenient circulation. However, on paper this shouldn't work, as the NHL12 is rated for a maximum TDP of 95 watts, while the 5950X generates 105, but more on thermals later. It also shouldn't fit my motherboard, which is the Gigabyte B550i Aorus Pro AX. But luckily this seems to be false, or maybe the later revisions of this mainboard changed. Whatever the case, the cooler just barely cleared, but it did clear all around and installed nicely onto the mainboard. I also needed to swap out the RAM because I was using normal sticks. Keep this in mind if you ever plan to do something similar and have a CPU cooler that extends over the RAM slots. Many brands do offer low profile variants, such as Corsair with their LPX series. The rest of the installation was business as usual. I decided to do this while this cheese layer was out on the table and inserted everything back into the skeleton afterwards. What I didn't do but should have done was also install the power supply cables while in this state too. It was still easy enough with the innards returned, but would have been easier if done before. Speaking of power supplies, this too I had to pick anew, since the Era 2 doesn't support full-sized ones. It does, however, have enough room for an SFX-L-sized one, but the more room the better, I guess. If you're like me coming from an ATX build, the power supply is likely also something that needs to be exchanged, even though there are several ITX cases out there that do support full-size PSUs, like the Meshilicious for example. But just like with the spine that prioritizes between GPU and CPU clearance, the larger power supply will take space away from somewhere, so keep this in mind. As many have pointed out before me, the fan orientation here is not optimal, as the hot air is being pushed down, directly opposing the fresh air that comes in through the bottom. However, as also reported by others, this doesn't seem to affect the performance much. Still, something to keep in mind that this may be an improvement to look forward to on the Era 3. Then it was time to finally install the GPU. As already teased, the fit was perfect, but on paper it also should have not worked, as Fractal's manual states a maximum width of 137mm, with the Liquid X being 140mm without the tubes, but a quick unscrewing of the power cables solved that. It's still tight, but unlike my spine after a day in front of the desk, there are no overly abnormal curves that could hinder the flow of water. Anyway, after a short bathroom break, I installed the top radiator, which is attached to the upper frame with this fantastic toolless mechanism that is incredibly satisfying to engage. It makes installing and, more importantly, debugging the case down the road incredibly easy, as you can simply lift up the top, even with the radiator attached, to get to the more guarded places inside of the PC. After sliding the beautiful outer shell back over all that was just installed, clearing everything nicely, it was finally time to place it in its new position and give it a spin. In the larger case, I never saw the GPU go above 45 degrees Celsius. On the Era 2, it is hovering around 50 to 55 after a couple hours of gaming, which is still fantastic, mind you. It's also fairly quiet, with only a noisy pump annoying me whenever I get too close. The 5950X isn't faring as great, with its temps almost doubling from a cool 50 degrees during the IDA 64 load test on the North to almost throttling levels at 88 degrees in the Era 2. The result of the less capable cooler is definitely noticeable, however, I'm surprised it's working at all. I was sure that I would have to resort to undervolting, which is a practice where you purposely lower the voltage of your CPU in order to prevent it from thermal throttling. However, in real-world usage, I never hit those temps. During video editing, for example, it only reaches about 78 degrees, which is the primary productivity use case for this rig. So for now, I actually left the settings without any adjustments. I will say though, it is audibly more noticeable as well. I'm keeping the fans quite low though, mostly around 40 to 50%, maybe 60 on the CPU, as this PC is spending most of its time in the living room, only moving to the office every 3 weeks when it is time to edit videos. I have to say though, it is almost undetectable during gameplay, as it is overshadowed by even the most modest volume levels from the speakers besides it, and doesn't feel much louder than the OG PS5 it is replacing. The Era 2 is all I had wished for. It fit all the hardware I already had, well, kind of, and keeps it cool, not to the confidence of the North, but enough. I'm also very happy with the design. The lines are soft and the top walnut exhaust makes it blend in perfectly with the other wooden elements around it. I wish its outer shell was a single piece like on more premium boutique cases though, instead of 4 screwed together panels, but for $199, which is still a lot, ITX taxes be damned, it's good enough, and besides it's placed in an area where this isn't bothering me all that much. It's still distinctively a computer though, let's not pretend this would resemble anything else but that. And in that area it shows its chops. Every detail on the inside seems to have been thoroughly thought about, from the adjustable spine to the ease of use during and post-installation, with all its additional options. The multiple clever mechanics, be it the ingenious top release or the secure lock by way of the dust filter, is very nice too. Speaking of that, you need to remove the dust filter at the bottom in order to be able to remove the outer shell. It's a pretty nice mechanism, but it's a little scary to think that these 2 at the front and 2 others at the back are all that's holding the guts from spilling out. But if you ever wondered or wanted to move your big rig into a smaller shell and lock it into a communal space, I can highly recommend the Era 2. I can also recommend the hardware I have. If gaming is the primary use case, a different, more modern CPU is probably a better choice, such as the very juicy 9800X3D. That one generates 120 watts of TDP though, so be very careful or read up on undervolting. There might also be better CPU cooling options out there than the NHL 12, but likely most people will not have an AIO-cooled GPU, resulting in a lot less compromised build than what I have. I also want to point out that the Era 2 isn't the smallest case that fits this hardware. There's a brave soul on Reddit that managed to jam all of this into a T1. I tip my hat to thee. I hope this was somewhat interesting to watch, and also tied up some loose ends on my Meshilicious build. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and a belated Happy New Year. On the next episode, I will take a look at the work ladder Nomad E, which I used to write this script and also edit the video. Until then, have a wonderful day and see you in the next one. Bye!